All right, we're all back from vacation. The average grade was an 81, 4 points lower. For some reason, those two chapters, I averaged that particular test being 4 points lower. Don't know why. The highest grade was 105. Average grade was an 81. So pretty consistent all the way through. If you would like to look at your tests, I'm available anytime you need. So without further ado, let us move on. Let's also talk about the next position paper coming up. And so the next position paper falls into line with our discussion in retailing and also, once again, with vertical integration. And this is going to be on autonomous vehicles. So autonomous vehicles need some kind of clarification. I don't know if you know it or not, but you're driving an autonomous vehicle right now. Anyone who has cruise control has a car that is by definition a somewhat autonomous one. What we're talking about is an autonomous vehicle that is known as a level 5, which means a vehicle that has complete control of driving, all right, that can drive from point A to point B unassisted without the intervention of a human to be able to perform it. And so this position paper is autonomous vehicles, ones that take complete control of driving, have the best chance to succeed if they're sold at regular automobile dealerships where people can compare the features with regular automobiles. Now, remember, as I said before, when you're coming up with an idea of whether or not you need to agree or disagree with this, take this particular sentence in phrases. And so if we're talking about complete control of driving, okay, best chance at automobile dealerships where they can compare features. If you believe this plus this plus this is true, then all this is true. And it's just a basic Boolean function, all right? Where you can attack it and disagree is where you feel like one of those phrases is not correct. If you believe that comparing features with regular automobiles is not important, that's where you do it. If you feel like automobile dealerships, the traditional dealerships, are not the basic best, then that's the way to put it, all right? You can attack it at each one of those levels, but if you agree that the best way to sell it is to compare it with the features of current automobiles, then that's the way you sell it, okay? All right. That will be, excuse me. That will be, no, there it is. That will be due on starter. Let's see. Do I have that position paper due date there? Yeah. Assignment is April 16th. That's when it'll be due. Okay. Okay, so without further ado, let us move on to chapter 6. Any questions or anything else need clarification along the way? Okay. So chapter 6, retail. Now, retail is one of those misunderstood categories because defining retailing takes a little bit of understanding. Why or how is one particular sale, a retail sale, and not a wholesale sale. If I were to go into the Staples here in Boone, how would they know what I would be buying as retail, or how would they be knowing that it's wholesale? And the truth is that there's a little bit of both that's going on. But what is the prime feature? So we'll talk a little bit about retail first, and then we'll talk about how to define retail. So unsurprisingly, retail, if you are looking at a reason or how to define retail, this is a test question. It comes down to the buying motive. The buying motive of the individual selling determines whether it is a retail sale or a wholesale sale. If I am buying a ream of paper, and I've said it before, if I'm buying a ream of paper for my daughter to draw at home, then I'm using it for personal consumption. And I am the ultimate end user of that particular product, and that is a retail sale. If I'm buying that same ream of paper of 500 sheets and I'm going to use it in the production of a playbill that I'm working on right now for the Blue Ridge Community Theater, then that would be a wholesale sale, because it would either be used for resale for a business or in the consumption in the generation of another product. If I'm directly using that good, then that would be a direct cost, and exactly what it sounds like. If I'm just buying it in just for general and administrative expenses, it would be an indirect cost, okay? Retailing are all those activities involved in selling goods and services to the consumer for their own personal consumption. But the primary way that we determine this is by the buying motive. And so if you see a question that says, what's the difference between a retail or a wholesale? It's always the buying motive. What's the reason for the purchase? Which makes it awful kind of hard if you are a company like Staples and you're trying to figure out what sale is which, because you're not going to go and ask your customers, hey, what are you using? So how big is big? Well, big is pretty big. Walmart's sales are still three times bigger than Carrefour. Now, Walmart's sales in comparison to Amazon, they're still twice as big as Amazon annually. I think that you might find that surprising. But Walmart has been very smart since 2014, especially when they bought Jet.com. They took the manager or the CEO of Jet.com and made him their chief information officer. They have made a series of very aggressive moves online that has helped to stabilize their location in relationship to where Amazon is. They own 5,000 stores, 5,500 worldwide. They employ 2.5 million people. There are 1.6 million people in the United States. They're the biggest employer in the United States. I should say the biggest private employer. Number one is the American government. And they are still the world's largest marketplace, averaging, I think, 1.1 billion in sales. And their sales online are creeping up into the effect of 150 million. So they are still a very substantial retailer. And it's interesting, and the fact is that globalization is something that has dramatically affected retailing. And we find that if we measure over years, we find the increase of globalism when it comes to retail outlets in the United States going overseas and vice versa. Anybody visit Aldi, by the way? Been there before? With the one in Hickory, or?
No, the one that's back in Clayton, where I'm from.
Oh, okay, that's cool. Interesting place, isn't it? Yeah, Aldi's a really interesting store. They come from Germany, as a matter of fact. They have LODIs as well. There are 2/3 are generally company brands. They have a very efficient system in the way that they work. I think less than a third of the things they sell are name brands, and yet they're very, very successful. One opened in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, where my son lives, and it just blew up. All right. We find that different ways of retailing works. There's always an open place for it. Now, you might consider the big shakeout has happened over the last decade or so, especially when it comes to retailing, and with COVID as well, has made things bad. But once again, you find things shake up a little bit, especially when you find consumers find new ways of getting things. So I talked about buy online, pick up in store, BOPIS. All right. That actually was written in 2007 by in an article in the Journal of Retailing. And so these things have been thought of before, but it's always the consumer who eventually drives these things. And buy online, pick up in store has brought people back to the retail outlets. After COVID and the initial scares, we had gone to something to the effect of 14 to 16% of all retail sales being online. We've actually pushed back a little bit to about 11, 12%. But it says overwhelmingly the power of retail is that consumers still want to be able to touch, taste, and feel what they're buying. All right. And so retail has a strong place, and I consider it to be there for a long time. Anybody buy a diamond ring online? No. Why would you not buy a diamond ring online? Just basic reasons. What would you think? That's a good one. Yeah. How would you know what you're getting? Is it sized correctly for your finger? While we're talking about that, wouldn't you want to see it on your hand first before you actually bought it? I mean, that's a very personal thing, the buying of jewelry. Jewelry is something that is intimate to us. There's the need to touch and feel and see what those looks like with us. And so, especially when it comes to goods like that, we're always going to want to go to a retail location and see it. I think I've mentioned this before. My wife bought 4 wedding dresses back 10 years ago. When you bought 4 wedding dresses because you had one you were going to jump in the lake with and one you were going to take pictures with and that kind of thing. She bought 2 of those online. I'm amazed. Anyway. So how do we make money with retail? And this is where we're going to start talking about some very messy concepts, especially when they have cost, and how do we leverage retail environments to provide some kind of maximum return. So retail, we sell and we buy. All right. We want to buy low and we want to sell high. And the margins between the selling of high and the buying of low ultimately are how you survive in the retail world. Now, here's the problem. As years go further and further and further, the margins between what we buy and we sell get narrower and narrower and narrower. Grocery stores. Grocery stores, their margin is 2%. And so I've said this before, $1 million, they'll only make $20,000 in sales. The number one thing that a supermarket makes money on is the deli, the cutting of their own meat. That's where they make the money. And if you're in any kind of rewards program, it's not surprising. That's where the biggest rewards come from, because that's where they have the biggest margins. Aldi, by the way, by them having store brands, their margins instead of 2% are 35%. So it means they work on a different model. But it's all the same thing. Buy as low as I can, manage my costs, and sell as high as I possibly can. There's no other way around it, okay? And so what we realize is that each one of these has their own particular way of managing. How do I manage the cost side and how I manage the demand side? Ultimately, how I manage those two things ultimately determines how successful I am in retail. So we'll talk about cost side. We'll talk about demand side. And then finally, a taxonomy kind of a analysis of all the other positioning strategies that are out there. So what would be the best place in the world? Well, it depends on what your organization is. But if I'm in a position that my retail requires an extensive amount of service, then usually what I'm looking at are high margins and low turnovers. Remember that turnover is the complete selling of every good in your store in a period of a year. Low turnover works when the goods are shelf stable and non-perishable. Usually, you're talking about goods that can last past a accounting cycle, all right? Otherwise known as durable goods. So an example of a high service retailing strategy, I would go back to my favorite example of Stihl tools. And so Stihl has something to the effect of a 35 to 40% margin. Generally, their goods cost quite a bit more, but Stihl, by their nature, gives a great deal more service. I've said before, if you go into a Stihl retail outlet, if you buy a chainsaw, there's a pretty good chance that the salesperson, if they don't know you, is going to ask, do you know how to open that up, put it together and service it, and gas it up, those kinds of things. That by its very nature requires a certain amount of support. Anybody ever start a chainsaw? Ever use one? Know which end to grab? You know, I mean, you know which is the bad side? I don't like that. You know, which way to point it? There's a lot that goes in on a chainsaw, from merely just starting it up and putting it against a tree. There's so many things you have to think of, and you do them automatically because you've done them before. But just think about the first person who started a chainsaw for the first time. It could be pretty scary. All right. Well, that's one of the ways you do it. A high service retailing system works from a high margin, has a low turnover, and that's generally how success happens. Well, they tend to be very niche. All right. In other words, services tend to be towards narrow markets where a certain extensive amount of retail experience is needed. And retail markets evolve. My first job, well, my second job, I worked as a store manager in a computer store in Lafayette, Louisiana for about 7 or 8 years. And this is when computer stores were very much high service. Well, of course, you know, the general public has flatlined that. They became commodities, and that's why retail prices are the way they are. So these things do move. Low retailing systems require low margins and high turnovers. And so if you're thinking about selling everything in the store, the number one thing you want to do is sell as many of those things as fast as you possibly can. What do we know about consumers? We're much more willing to trade lower service levels for lower prices. But if consumers are unwilling, then we have to be very careful about what we sell. There's some particular items that consumers demand a certain amount of service with. And yet, you can't cut prices to the very bone. So what do? Generally, what we have to do is we have to find ways of lowering operating costs. And sometimes that means we only tweak certain service outputs. But at some point, you've cut to the bone and you're in trouble. I think Dollar General, may have hit its peak in terms of how far they can go in terms of flatlining their costs. So my wife is Swedish, and so everything that our daughters owned for the first 6 years of their lives was H&M. H&M has a very unique kind of way that they've been able to do their work. They do a very good, efficient job of going out and purchasing in lots that are very low price. So, but they maintain the quality of the fabrics that they have. So they've been able to find out. So cost side positioning strategies, high service ones have high margins, low turnover, low price retailing systems, which is the vast majority. If I have low margins, I have to have high turnovers. I have to be able to move product. So one of the most important ways in which we measure this is what's known as the strategic profit model. Now, I don't want you to get caught up in a lot of these calculations here. I'll point them out to you, the ones that are the most important. But the strategic profit model says that there are certain formulas that are more important than anything else. And so it says that if you know nothing about retailer, if you just look at these four, they will help you manage your retail outlet. And so what these say is that there are four things they want you to be able to manage. The first thing they want you to do is manage your margins. Okay. They want you to manage your margins, which is net profit over net sales. Okay. So that's the first thing that they're asking. So what does net profit over net sales means? Net profit is everything, or what is the money that is left over after I pay everything else. So that's what net profit is. Net sales is total sales minus returns and those kind of things. And so what does that ratio say? Well, what it says is the higher that this number is, the higher that margin that you're making on your sales. And so if I sell $1,000 worth of goods and my net profit is $200, then it's a 20% rate, which is good. Higher number is better. Always. Higher number is better. And while you want to generate as many sales as you possibly can, you also want to be able to generate as much profit from each sale that you can. And so that's net profit over net sales. The next is you want to manage asset turnover. You want to manage asset turnover, which is net sales over total assets. Now, if you'll notice, we'll talk about financial leverage in a minute, but total assets is not net worth, okay? total assets are all the goods that you have. Net worth is, it takes into account how much money you borrow in order to have those assets. That's known as the leverage, okay? So, asset turnovers, I want this number to be as high as it possibly can be. And how do I make this number higher? The way that I make this number higher is I do my best to reduce my total assets. I make this number lower. And that's how I affect my costs. I do more with less. I start setting up just in time in terms of deliveries. I try to make sure I have nothing on my shelves that can spoil for whatever reason. Shelf stability many times is the lifeblood of organizations. And also its lifespan as well, all right? Fast-moving consumer goods are exactly what they sound like. They're goods that spend very little time on the shelf. They're great to have in, but you have to think of all your assets when you're planning how much you're going to stock your inventory with. So, net sales over total assets. Financial leverage, this is a big one. Financial leverage, which is total assets over net worth, it's basically a number that states how much of your total assets are financed with debt. Financial leverage on how you play this can be the lifeblood or death of your corporation. Toys R Us, I don't know how many of you remember Toys R Us, but Toys R Us was a company that went under because of financial leveraging. They made big bets on several of the big movies and they bombed. And because they bombed, Toys R Us bombed as well. If I were to look at corporations that have difficulty with financial leverage, excuse me, so these are the retailers who had some pretty difficult times during COVID, and they were very heavily leveraged. And if I were to show you the list, let's see where they are. These were the ones that were put in real difficulty in financial leveraging. They basically had too much of their assets financed by debt. And you can look at them and all of these retailers, all of them were in some form of difficulty. I haven't checked. I'm not sure whether any of those, in essence, have gone out of business or not. But their financial health, financial leverage comes from that one particular calculation: total assets over net worth. And so, the higher the number, the worse. Okay. If you have a lot of assets, but not a lot of net worth, you're in trouble. Finance, there's what's called the quick ratio. The quick ratio is the total number of liquid assets that you have, usually cash on hand and accounts receivable. Do you have enough to pay for your accounts receivable, or excuse me, your accounts payable? That's another kind of ratio that's out there, but it's very much around this whole point about financial leverage. And the last is net worth. which is very straightforward. Net worth is very simple. Net profit, return on net worth, return on net worth, which is net profit over net worth. And you can look at this and see this is actually a goal, all right? This is a goal when you're forecasting. You're trying to secure a targeted return on your net worth, and this does more to tell whether you're building success or failure. So, what's your net profit? How much money have you cleared? What's your net worth? Once you pay all your bills, what's that ratio? And so the strategic profit model has these 4 things that are vitally important when it comes to understanding success in retail: margins, turnover, financial leverage, and a targeted return. Those are the 4 things that strategic profit models are supposed to do. And if any of you are in supply chain, turnover is going to be the number 1 thing that you're going to be focused with for most of your career. Your ability to successfully manage the flow will mean the success or failure to the organizations you work with. Okay, so we got our models, okay? We have the things that we're focusing on, but it's time now to talk about what are the strategies that are used to maximize our efficiency on the floor itself. So, there are 3 ways that we can improve our profitability. Gross margin return on inventory investment. And I'll talk about all of these. I love this. I had a guy in last year who was a major buyer for Dollar General, and he used Gimros and Gimroy when he was talking. I went, that's great. My students actually got to hear it really there. So, gross margin return on inventory investment, Gimroy. Gross margin per full-time equivalent employee, Gimroll. And gross margin per square foot, Gimros. What you want to do with each one of these, I'll talk about one at a time. So, gross margin return on inventory investment. What does this calculation say? It says the gross margin percentage times sales over inventory at cost, all right? What it's asking you to do is it's asking you to note what is the maximum return on each individual item sold. And so your hope is to improve the sales per square foot. Gimroy is around improving your sales per square foot. Every single piece that comes through, you want to maximize its potential for sales. And because we're talking about 2 sides, we're talking about demand and supply, we're talking about sales over with cost. We increase our gross margin on inventory investment by decreasing the inventory that we have. So once again, supply side people, It is the efficient movement of goods, having the goods exactly when they're needed, which is what just-in-time is. Being efficient in the process itself. And that is a way of reducing inventory, because the number one thing in this formula for success is this bad boy right here. Inventory needs to be reduced. So I visited Columbia Forest Products during spring break, and I got to watch them do their system, and it was very fascinating. The way they built hardwood panels for supply, and they are a total just-in-time shipment manufacturing location. They've got about 5 to 7 days of supply of wood. Wood comes in 24 hours a day. It is shipped out. In terms of storage of inventory, it's practically non-existent. It's great. Now, the problem with gross margin on inventory investment is it only accounts for the cost of goods sold. And that is the weakness of GMRL. And so it's a good plan, but it's not the best. Usually you need a couple, three to go in. So gross margin, return on inventory investment. Next is gross margin per full-time equivalent employee. The goal of GMRL is to improve sales per employee. What you're hoping to do is optimize sales in a given square foot, but by employee. So the example is this. I have a big store. In this location, especially in a busy season, like any holiday season is, there's some things, some costs that are never going to go up. You're always going to have rent, utilities, advertising. None of those costs are going to go up. But you have the opportunity to sell as much as you possibly can. And so if I have a department and I do not have sufficient employees, or let's just say I have sufficient, but I could sell even more if I had more sales, then what this means is that if I put one more person or even two more people in the same place, my sales will increase, perhaps not in the same way, because you'll start to have cannibalizing of sales between employees, but your profitability is going to go up. And so Walmart, take note, if you have more people out there, you might sell more. They're not listening. But anyway, Dollar General, you better listen. Anyway, having more individuals, by the way, Dollar General doesn't do GMRL. They would be able to add additional sales. And so that's what gross margin per full-time equivalent employee means. More people means more sales. Doesn't mean that everybody sells the same amount, but it just means you get, okay? So we talked about improving sales per square foot, per employee. Now we're going to talk about it on each transaction. Gross margin per square foot says that each location needs to be able to maximize sales. If I'm in a particular aisle, let's say I'm talking about bread. Bread is one of those 2% items. However, delis do bake bread as well. But generally, you have a certain margin on all the things that are out there. Now, what I find interesting is that I've never seen an explosion like bread like I have now, especially keto breads. Oh my gosh, Dave's breads. It's really unique. And of course, every reason why you specialize is because you can charge a higher margin, all right? Well, what gross margin per square foot needs to do is maximize the profits by reducing costs. And so what we want to do is we want to put pressure on suppliers to give us a break. Or what we want to do is we want to make our suppliers speed up inventory replenishment. The faster we stock the shelves, the better they get, the faster they get sold. And not only that, but if we can shift some of those costs back to the suppliers to do their own stocking, then in essence, we've taken the cost off of us and put it on them. Walmart is one of the largest stores that does this as well. I talked about at one point, I don't know if this was going a decade ago, Coke said, we are no longer going to stock your shelves. You go stock them for us. And Walmart said, we'll concentrate on Pepsi products. That's great. Have a good day. Coke came back and said, wait a minute. No, I think they can stock your shelves. And that was an example of how power gets exerted, two very big corporations. But Walmart was going to shift or keep those prices or the cost shifted back to the suppliers. And that's why when you go into a Walmart, you see a lot of people besides Walmart people stocking the shelves. And most retailers do, okay? So what you're hoping to do is fix your costs as much as you can, have efficient inventory management control systems. If I can reduce those marginal costs, I can increase the gross margin in every single square foot that's there. I think I've said it before, the number one gross margin per square foot stores in the world are Apple stores. They have the highest per square foot, per square inch. They're even higher margins than diamond stores. All right. So they apparently are doing something right. Okay, I'm going to stop there because we're going to talk about demand side positioning on Thursday. So I hope you all have a good day. Take care.